everyone, and thank you very much for joining NextLabs for our webinar titled Enhancing SharePoint Compliance with Attribute-Based Policies. My name is Rochelle, and I'm happy to host this webinar. I am proud to introduce today's speakers, Dave Gordon and Bill Armstrong. Dave is a Microsoft strategist with NextLabs and has over 5 years experience consulting with customers on SharePoint governance, compliance, and infrastructure management. He has worked on both local and enterprise-wide projects with a focus on improving security, business processes, and productivity for his customers using the Microsoft technology stack. Bill is a senior sales engineer with NextLabs and has over 10 years of systems administration experience, including over 5 years of SharePoint experience, and is SharePoint MCITP certified. He has experience with large enterprise customers working on projects focused on SharePoint governance, compliance, implementation, and administration, and has worked on several large global implementation projects. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Dave.
Thanks, Rochelle, for that introduction. So briefly, I just want to cover the agenda for today. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what we do at NextLabs and why we do what we do. Then I'm going to hand it over to Bill to talk about some of the common SharePoint authorization challenges, how attribute-based access control can help overcome some of these challenges. And then I'll take it back over and talk a little bit about a customer that we've worked with here at NextLabs, and then hopefully have a little time for Q&A. Again, I appreciate your time. We have a 30-minute presentation today, so let's get to it here. So to talk a little bit about what we do at NextLabs. So what Bill and I do on a day-to-day basis, really our goal is to enhance compliance and secure collaboration for SharePoint. Now, we do this. We do this because we understand that our customers are now storing, sharing, collaborating with more content than ever before in SharePoint. So not only locally, but externally with partners, vendors, suppliers, contractors, what have you. So our goal is to make sure that they can do this in a secure way, right, to have that fine-grained access control. So we do this in a little bit different approach than what you may have seen before. So we use attribute-based access control or attribute-based authorization management. Now, some of you might be scratching your head saying, well, I don't really know what attribute-based access control is. I've heard of attributes before. You know, an attribute could be my name's, Dave Gordon. I'm a Microsoft strategist, or NextLabs. I'm a U.S. employee. Those could all be just my attributes. But we also take attributes not only of the identity, but also of the context and the content, as you can see in the diagram that I have here displayed. So now we can talk about attributes of context. How am I accessing the SharePoint environment? Where am I accessing the SharePoint environment from? Maybe when am I accessing the SharePoint environment? And also the attributes of the content or the item itself. So maybe this is ITAR data, or it's PCI or PII data, right? So we can take all these attributes to build fine-grained policies to enforce access control within our environment. We also get on projects around rights management as well, digital rights management. So not only protecting content within the environment, but also as it leaves the environment, we can encrypt data and protect it as well. So when it comes to attribute-based access control, we really consider ourselves thought leaders in this space. We work with several organizations that I have listed here to create the standards for attribute-based access control. Most recently, we worked with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which our efforts made it to be a publication that's going to be released by NIST. We also currently own over 30 patents and have another 30 patents pending in attribute-based access control space. Why do we have so much investment, spend so much time in attribute-based access control and access management? Well, I have this diagram up here that shows kind of the evolution of access management. Now, if we look back at the early 80s, we're talking about groups and access control lists, right? This is back when the data and the applications were tied really close together. And then around the early 90s, this idea of role-based access control was released to the market. So a role is, again, who I am within the organization. My role designates whether or not I get access to content or not, right? Now, we have to all think back to the early 90s. This is back when internet was in its infancy, when organizations weren't regularly using email to communicate with one another. So it's kind of odd to me to think that organizations these days are still using this role-based access control approach when our requirements have changed so much. Now we have to take into consideration like BYOD, government regulation, global communication, which we didn't have to take into consideration back in the early 90s, right? So now that's where this context comes into play, right? So not just, who I am accessing the environment, where I'm accessing it from, when I'm accessing this environment, is it from my own device, is it outside the country? These are all considerations that we have to factor in when making a decision of whether we can get access to content or not. So that's why we really believe that attribute-based access control is the way of the future. And what's great is that we're not the only ones that are saying that. Gartner actually published an article saying that they believe that attribute-based access control, we were going to see a big shift towards that direction in the market. So by 2020, they say around 70% of organizations are either going to be moving towards attribute-based access control or going to be investigating attribute-based access control for their environment because of the context that I mentioned there, right? So how that people are accessing the environment is so crucial. So hopefully that gives you a little bit idea about what we do and why we do what we do on a day-to-day basis at NextLabs. I'm going to hand it over to Bill so he can cover some more specifics around SharePoint attribute-based access control and how it overcomes some of the concerns. Bill?
Great. Thank you, Dave. So just to review, the first piece of my presentation, we're going to go over how SharePoint security is managed today. Some of the main issues that we run into based off of what SharePoint provides out of the box. So there's two different ways that we typically manage permissions in SharePoint. So the first being role-based permissions. So a role being what department am I in, which organization do I work in, what projects am I on. So all these different things would make up a role. And roles are typically managed through either Active Directory group memberships or SharePoint group memberships. So this is the most common way that things are done. There are a few difficulties that organizations typically run into when managing permissions like this. So one of the main ones being, and I'll go into these in a little more detail later, but so things like roles change. So people moving into different roles, different organizations. Then environment attributes not being considered. So Dave just touched on what environment attributes are. Maybe we need to take into consideration when a user is logging into SharePoint or where they're accessing it from. Visibility into group memberships has always been a difficulty. So you add an Active Directory group to SharePoint. There's no real easy way to be able to tell who has access to that content, so you might not know who you're sharing it with. And then reusability of SharePoint groups is typically an issue. You can only use a SharePoint group across one site collection, so you can't really repurpose them across multiple farms, multiple sites. And then what we call role explosion. So role explosion being, most organizations start out with having a specific role for maybe somebody with a certain title in a certain department, but that grows out from there to, as you get into more complex environments, what is this person, what projects is this person working on, what's their title, what department are they working in, what's their country of origin, all these different things might make up one role. So when you talk about, maybe if I have 100 different projects, now we're looking at, 10 to 20 roles per project. So it becomes more and more difficult to actually, manage that. And then the other way that SharePoint security is typically managed is container-based. So managing permissions at the site collection level, site list library, item document level, and this also has a typical set of difficulties around it. So in this case, we're relying on people to store content in the correct containers. So permissions have already been set on a container, and we have to make sure that confidential content is stored in the correct location. So what happens when a confidential document is stored, like in our main intranet site or public-facing site? What happens? How does that get secured? Overhead and managing granular permissions. So again, a lot of difficulty goes into when we start talking about breaking inheritance at the document level, how much management goes into that, and also difficulties around who actually manages permissions in SharePoint. So SharePoint permission management, so most organizations typically do it one of two ways, or a combination of the two. One being SharePoint administrators typically manage the permissions across the environment, or business users, the people who actually own the sites, manage their own content. And again, both these, each way has pros and cons. So some of the difficulties around SharePoint admins, managing permissions is they don't own the content. They're not familiar with the content. They don't know which each business unit is doing with the content, with their sites, how it's being managed. So it's difficult to lean on the administrators to be able to, make those types of determinations because, they're ultimately not responsible for compliance. They don't know how compliance laws work. How should ITAR content be secured? Who should have access to it? How do we manage those types of things? That's more on the business side. But then you run into issues from managing permissions from the business side because they're not SharePoint security experts. They don't manage Active Directory groups, so they can't easily update permissions. They don't manage user attributes. So it becomes a difficulty. So where we go with this is, ultimately at a high level, the business is determining who should have access to what types of content. So that meaning, compliance. Typically, the compliance team is going to determine who should have access to what type of data. But they're not going to be managing SharePoint, so that's where ABAC comes in. Being able to create these high-level policies across the environment to manage access to types of data. So some of the common challenges in SharePoint. So we touched on a few of these. So users' roles change. So somebody moves into a different department. They're no longer on a project, and so when this happens, there's a lot of overhead in managing. We need to update security groups. We need to update SharePoint permissions. Make sure that when a user's role changes, they don't have access to the wrong content. So this is something that we'll be able to help address with ABAC. Data segregation. So this is also something I touched on. What happens when confidential data is uploaded to the wrong location? So natively in SharePoint, there's no really easy way to control this other than to break inheritance at the document level, change permissions to that document, or move that data to another location. There's no real automated way to do this because somebody has to identify that the document was actually uploaded to the wrong location, and that goes back to not being able to really determine who has access to the content, if the user isn't really familiar with SharePoint or compliance regulations. And also just incorrect permissions. So, we might have a specific type of data that requires, certain permissions, and the person managing it might set incorrect permissions. There's no automated way to really control this. So somebody might share content accidentally with people who shouldn't have access to it. Maybe they assign too many permissions. Maybe certain users with a certain role or attribute are only supposed to be able to read this content, but we accidentally assign read-write permissions. Those are the types of things that we can more easily control with ABAC across the environment. Export compliance. So being able to verify citizenship, these are the types of things that SharePoint doesn't do out of the box, and it's difficult to rely on an end user to be managing this type of access to, highly controlled or confidential data. Especially natively in SharePoint, not even be able to really see where a user's viewing a document from. We can't control in SharePoint if a user is accessing a document from outside the United States, even though they're a U.S. citizen, they're supposed to have access to the content. There's no real easy way to actually avoid that. So now I'm going to go into a quick overview of what ABAC is, and then we'll talk a little bit about actually how ABAC can resolve some of the issues that I just went through. So we touched a little bit about on the types of attributes that are out there, so identity, context, and content. So identity being attributes of the users themselves, so being able to see what department a user's in, what kind of clearance they have, what's their country of origin. All these types of things go into the identity of a user. Not all organizations manage this information just in Active Directory. That's going to be leveraged by SharePoint. It might be in HR systems, any number of external systems. So we need a good way to be able to combine those attributes and actually make policy decisions based on them. Context, so being able to determine where a user's accessing that content from. Is it outside the U.S.? Is it a specific IP address, specific office or computer? What time are they accessing it? Those types of things. And then attributes of the content itself. So the type of data, metadata, column values in SharePoint, content type, tags, attributes in the document itself. So being able to make policy determinations based off this. So this is an example of an ABAC policy. So again, something that we can't do out of the box in SharePoint, because SharePoint's really just, we create a role, we assign permissions to documents. So we're not making a policy decision who can access content in real time, but with ABAC we can do that. So in this case, we have a policy that's been set, by the compliance team that says, we only want to allow U.S. employees located in Chicago to be able to access client A's data. So that would be extremely difficult to do in SharePoint. So we're talking multiple different roles. We're also having to control, when the user is actually in the Chicago office. All things that can't be done natively in SharePoint. So a combination of the subject attributes, environment attributes, and resource attributes go into making the decision if a user can access this policy, access the content through this policy. So this is something that we can do with ABAC very easily that we can't do natively with SharePoint. And this is just a quick overview of how information control policy works. So what ABAC is, so this is the ABAC reference architecture. So on the right, we have the SharePoint environment, so the policy enforcement point. So this is where the user's accessing the content. They make a request to access this data. The enforcer sends the request to the policy controller, and that policy controller makes a decision based on the user attributes, environment attributes, and content attributes to decide whether or not that user should have access to that content. Sends the decision back to SharePoint, the enforcement point, and then that user is either presented with the content or presented with an access denied message. So again, we're leveraging all of these different attributes instead of just looking at, say, a container in SharePoint and deciding whether or not a user has access based on that, just because we don't get the flexibility that we might need, in this day and age with the way, compliance regulations are. So how do we actually use attribute-based access control to solve some of the issues that we referenced earlier? So a few different things. So ABAC policies are centralized. So we talked about how policies are typically written by, say, a compliance team at a high level, and there's no real easy way to translate that into SharePoint roles. So with ABAC, we can write a centralized policy that can apply to any number of containers in SharePoint. It could be across farms, it could be across sites, across any document with a specific attribute, across for users who have a specific attribute. So all these different things could be authored in one different location and make policy determinations across all SharePoint. If we were talking about doing this for individual sites, individual documents, users, and roles, it would be a huge undertaking to manage all of this and still not being able to actually control based on where a user is located or any of those resource attributes. So that's something that ABAC can help solve easily. The policies combined with SharePoint permissions is an extra level of control. So we're not talking about replacing SharePoint permissions. You still have your SharePoint permissions in place as a first level of control, but then these high-level policies can be used to make high-level decisions whether or not content can be accessed. So we're still managing SharePoint permissions at a low level if needed, and then these policies are going to combine with those SharePoint permissions to make policy decisions. Attribute changes have an immediate impact. So again, say a user's role change that has to natively that would have to filter to Active Directory, then someone would have to go in and change that user's group memberships. But if we're keying off a user attribute, say in an HR system, an attribute change, maybe that user's role changes, they move to a different department, the clearance changes, what type of data they're supposed to have access to. So the HR system as a system of record might update that attribute. And then immediately, ABAC will be able to leverage those attributes to make policy decisions. So we don't have to wait for that change to filter back to Active Directory and then maybe back to SharePoint permissions and an admin having to get involved in making those changes. The attribute change can be leveraged immediately to ensure that the correct users have access to content. And being able to, again, we talked a lot about being able to leverage environment attributes, where the users accessing content from, but also we have data segregation. So again, I talked about how a user might upload a document to an incorrect location. Well, ABAC can leverage the data segregation to control access to that content. So if we have a document that's tagged as ITAR, uploaded to the wrong location, data segregation and ABAC will control access to that content until somebody reviews it. So we make sure that even if documents are uploaded to the wrong location, based on the policy, based on the attributes of that document, we can control access to it still. And security and search trimming, so making sure that even though the user, so the policy is determining whether or not the user can access the content, but we can also do, using ABAC, security and search trimming. So we make sure that those documents don't show up in search results. Or, in web parts, so, user goes to a main page in their site, and maybe we trim those web parts from their view so that they can't see that content. So these are all different ways that ABAC will help resolve some of those common concerns that we have with SharePoint security management. And some of the other benefits of leveraging ABAC, being able to leverage those attributes for rights management. So being able to, when content leaves SharePoint, being able to use those attributes of users to determine whether or not they can access rights-protected files. Again, leveraging across the enterprise. So maybe these policies are actually applied beyond just SharePoint, maybe to other enterprise systems. So being able to just author a policy in one location. Integration with other systems. So maybe as part of our export control regulations, we need to check an external system to see if a user has a license to a document. So we could integrate with those systems to help use that information for policy decisions and also for centralized auditing. So auditing in SharePoint is always a difficulty. We can leverage ABAC to actually audit access and decisions made about who's accessing what content, and use centralized auditing across the enterprise to track that. So again, another thing we can do using ABAC. Preparing to leverage ABAC, so we talked a lot about how ABAC can actually help resolve these issues, but also, so you might be asking, how do I actually implement this in my environment? So high level, there's typically 3 steps that we see. So the first is data classification. So organizations typically do a lot of data classification. So we can leverage existing column values, or you could use an automated classification system that maybe scans content for certain keywords, tags it a certain way, and then we would leverage those SharePoint column values to make policy decisions. The next step would be defining policies. So most organizations already have policies defined at a high level, again, maybe probably by the compliance team saying, users with this attribute should only be able to access this content. Well, those policies are typically already written. We just need to translate them to policies in the system and user attributes. So we need user attributes to be able to make these decisions. Most organizations typically don't have them in Active Directory. They may be in an HR system, and there's no real connection between the two. So we can set up our solution to actually integrate between them, pull attributes from multiple different locations to help make those policy decisions. So I'm going to pass it back to Dave, just so he can talk a little bit about a case study that we have.
All right, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on the customer quick that we've worked with in the past, to kind of show you how we have helped them overcome some of their concerns with attribute-based access control in SharePoint, right? So this customer is a high-tech company customer. They actually are a global organization. You see there they have over 30,000 employees. They also have over 30,000 users in SharePoint, right? So they heavily use SharePoint within their environment. And what they were finding out was employees, including their product engineers and researchers, were using the collaboration sites to post and share their design documents. So they found that protecting that intellectual property and limiting access to employees, contractors, suppliers was very challenging. I mentioned that before, that now we are sharing more sensitive content than ever before. With outside of the organization, they found it really challenging still do that and protect their intellectual property, protect who could access that content. So they decided that they needed a fine-grained solution to restrict access to content to only qualified employees in North America. So again, they were a global organization. They needed to be able to make policies to restrict access to content to only U.S. employees that were qualified employees. So really, they came to us, and using our entitlement manager solution for SharePoint. We first classified the data and tagged the data and segregated the data. And then we built policies off of that. So these fine-grained policies now to control access to those qualified employees using attribute-based access control. And then also we had offered them a detailed reporting because reporting and auditing was really important to them for them to be able to stay compliant. So we offered that to them as well. So that was kind of that complete solution. So now they can have the proper employees accessing the sensitive information, and then they can also track that to throw up red flags if there's somebody that shouldn't be accessing the content to X, right? So that's kind of just a high-level overview of a customer that we have worked with. So at this time, I think we have a few minutes still for Q&A. So if you guys have some questions, please type them in the chat and let us know, and we'd be happy to answer those questions for you. All right, I got a question here. First question is, can't SharePoint audiences be used to address these issues? Bill, do you want to answer that for him?
Sure. So typically SharePoint audiences can be used to target content at specific users. So similar to what we were talking about with like security trimming and search trimming, but it's not really recommended as a security mechanism because really all it's doing is hiding content from a user's view. So you can still say, you know, user A with this attribute is going to be able to see this document. But it doesn't actually control access to that content. You still need to make sure that you have the underlying permissions correct in SharePoint, so they'd still be able to access that content. So with an ABAC solution, we can say, you know, with that policy, we control if the user can actually see the content, but then also control, you know, if they try to access it even through a direct link. Still present them with an access denied page, and also say, you know, you can't view this document because of this specific policy, you know, saying, you know, you're outside the U.S. today, so you can't view this ITAR protected content. So that's probably the difference between what ABAC would provide versus, you know, an audience.
All right, thanks, Bill. Let's see here. I got one more question. It says that this method relies a lot on data classification. How do most companies handle this?
Sure. So I touched a little bit on this at the end. Data classification is always a concern for most organizations. So there's typically some tagging going on in SharePoint, some governance around it, but relying on users to tag content properly in SharePoint, or even using it, or you know, doing it when they're authoring Office documents, can typically be difficult. So we see it done a few different ways. So you know, one, governance, training the users to tag content when it's uploaded to SharePoint. But also, you know, implementing automated data classification solutions. So there's solutions out there that will scan content as it's uploaded and to say, you know, maybe we're looking for this keyword or this customer or this, you know, part number, and then tagging the content based on that information automatically in a SharePoint column. So that's the most common way. And also there's classification solutions for, you know, the Office client where you can select a classification that will follow the document, you know, into SharePoint when it's uploaded. So those are mostly the ways that we see it done that can really be a good, you know, starting point to be able to start leveraging ABAC for security in SharePoint.
All right, great, thanks, Bill. Well, it doesn't look like we got too many other questions here, and we're at the 30-minute point for our webinar, so I think we can pretty much wrap it up. Rochelle, do you have anything?
Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Bill and Dave, for a great presentation. And before we end today's call, I would like to encourage all of you to reach out to Tiffany Fan to request a copy of our white paper, Managing Information Risk for Microsoft SharePoint. You could schedule a meeting or schedule a demo as well. We will be sending out the recording of this webinar in the next week or so, so please watch out for it. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope the session has been informative for you. This concludes our NextLabs webinar. Bye-bye.